What was really happened?
The story of Transworld Airlines Flight 800 begins not with tragedy, but with routine. It was a Wednesday evening in mid-July, the heart of summer travel season in 1996. John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York was bustling with the familiar rhythm of transatlantic departures. Among the dozens of flights scheduled that evening was TWA Flight 800, a service that had been operating for years, connecting New York to Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you're standing by for Washington, our next departure will be the 2 o'clock.
None could have imagined they were about to become part of aviation history. Transworld Airlines, known universally as TWA, was at that time one of America's iconic carriers. Founded in 1930, the airline had helped define the golden age of aviation. By the 1990s, TWA was facing financial pressures and increased competition, but it remained a respected name in international travel. Flight 800 was one of their flagship routes, a nightly departure that business travelers and tourists alike relied upon.
And it should be leaving at a C-41. So if you want to head over to C-41 and remain seated, hopefully be able to help you a little later.
This particular aircraft had been in service for 25 years, having first flown in 1971. In aviation terms, this made it a mature aircraft, but not unusually old. The Boeing 747, affectionately known as the Queen of the Skies. The crew assembled for Flight 800 that evening represented a wealth of experience. Captain Ralph Kevorkian, age 58, had logged over 18,000 flight hours during his career. He had been with TWA for more than 30 years and was known among colleagues as a meticulous, safety-conscious pilot. His first officer, Stephen Snyder, age 57, brought his own impressive credentials to the cockpit, with nearly 17,000 hours of flight time. The flight engineer, Richard Campbell Jr., age 63, completed the flight deck crew. Together, these three men had accumulated more than 50,000 hours of aviation experience. They had flown through storms, managed mechanical issues, and handled countless routine flights. By all measures, this was a highly qualified crew.
Good morning, sunshine.
Our 14 flight attendants prepared for the journey ahead. TWA prided itself on service, and this crew was trained to handle everything from serving meals to managing emergency situations. Most had been with the airline for years, some for decades. They knew the 747 systems, its quirks, its sounds. They could sense when something was amiss. That evening, as passengers boarded and stowed their luggage, for Flight 800 told a diverse story. Among the 212 passengers were families heading to France for summer vacations, students participating in exchange programs, business executives, and French nationals returning home. There was a group of 16 students and 5 chaperones from Montoursville Area High School in Pennsylvania, excited about a French club trip to Paris. There were honeymooning couples, there were elderly travelers visiting relatives. The youngest passenger was an infant, just 8 months old. The oldest was in their 80s. This cross-section of humanity, from different backgrounds and different stages of life, shared one thing in common that evening. The 747 itself was an engineering marvel, even by 1996 standards. When it first entered service in 1970, it revolutionized air travel.
Turn right at 250, maintain 5200 to establish an approach.
47-100 variant, like the one operating as Flight 800, could carry over 350 passengers in a typical configuration, though TWA's layout accommodated fewer for additional comfort. The aircraft was powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney JT-9D turbofan engines, each capable of producing over 46,000 pounds of thrust. Over 50,000 gallons in various tanks throughout the aircraft structure. The center wing tank, located in the wing box between the fuselage and the wings, was a distinctive feature of the 747's design. This particular tank would later become the focus of intense investigation. The weather that evening was nearly perfect for flying. The National Weather Service reported clear skies over the New York metropolitan area, with visibility exceeding 10 miles. Surface winds were light, out of the southwest at about 8 knots. The temperature was a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit.
This is your captain speaking.
There were no thunderstorms in the area, no significant turbulence forecasted, no weather systems that would cause concern for pilots or air traffic controllers. It was, by all accounts, an ideal evening for flying. The aircraft had been sitting on the tarmac at JFK for several hours before departure. It had arrived earlier that afternoon as an inbound flight from Athens, Greece. During the turnaround time, while passengers deplaned, cargo was unloaded, the cabin was cleaned, and new passengers boarded, the aircraft remained stationary. Thus, the auxiliary power unit, a small jet engine in the tail that provides electrical power and air conditioning when the main engines are shut down, ran continuously during this ground time. What was not immediately apparent was that the air conditioning packs, located beneath the center wing fuel tank, were generating heat. Lots of heat. The center wing tank on this particular flight was not full. In fact, it contained only about 50 gallons of fuel, a relatively small amount for a tank designed to hold over 12,000 gallons. This was intentional and normal. Airlines often use fuel management strategies to optimize aircraft weight and balance. Was creating a situation that would later be understood as dangerous. But on that July evening, nobody in the aviation industry recognized this as a risk. The concept of fuel tank flammability due to vapor accumulation in low fuel conditions was not yet part of the industry's safety consciousness. As boarding completed, the flight crew performed their pre-departure checks.
Just about ready to depart. We should be away on schedule in the next couple of minutes or so.
Commercial pilot knows by heart. They verified flight control movements, checked fuel quantities, reviewed the flight plan, and confirmed all systems were operating normally. Flight engineer Campbell monitored the aircraft's mechanical systems, watching gauges and indicators that told the story of the 747's health. Everything checked out perfectly. The aircraft was mechanically sound, properly fueled, and ready for the 8-hour journey across the Atlantic.
Flight time will be 9 hours and 40 minutes. We'll eventually reach a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet.
Departure runways. The aircraft, weighing nearly 600,000 pounds, fully loaded with fuel, passengers, cargo, and crew, began its slow roll toward the departure end. Captain Kevorkian advanced the throttles, and the 4 massive engines spooled up, their distinctive whine audible even inside the insulated cabin. Passengers felt the familiar push into their seatbacks. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across Long Island. Families on beaches were packing up after a day in the sun. Fishermen were heading back to shore. In the towns and villages along the coast, people were settling in for a quiet summer evening. Above them, Flight 800 climbed steadily into the deepening blue of the evening sky, its navigation lights blinking, its engines leaving 4 thin contrails in the humid air. The flight was exactly on schedule. No hint of what was about to unfold. In the cockpit, the crew was relaxed, professional, going through the familiar rhythms of a routine departure. In the cabin, flight attendants were preparing for the meal service that would begin once the aircraft reached cruise altitude. Passengers were settling in, some reading, some dozing, some gazing out the windows at the receding coastline below. The aircraft climbed through 5,000 feet, then 10,000. Air traffic control issued routine instructions.
Flight 019er, 2 miles northeast, turn left at 90, maintain 4,800 to a...
Climbing at the programmed rate toward its initial assigned altitude of 13,000 feet. Below, the lights of Long Island's South Shore towns glittered in the gathering dusk. The Atlantic Ocean stretched eastward, dark and vast. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. But in the nearly empty center wing tank, invisible to the crew, to the passengers, to anyone, a dangerous mixture was forming. Fuel vapor, heated by the air conditioning units below, was accumulating in the space above the small amount of liquid fuel. The vapor concentration was approaching what engineers call the flammable range, the perfect mixture of fuel and air that, given an ignition source, will explode. The tank's fuel quantity indication system, designed to measure how much fuel remained, had wiring running through this vapor-filled space. That wiring, 25 years old, had insulation that had degraded over time. This brief exchange represented the beginning of what should have been a typical progression of altitude assignments.
Turn left at 90, maintain 4800 to establish an approach.
In the cabin, passengers were beginning to relax. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated, but the initial anxiety that some travelers feel during takeoff was subsiding. Flight attendants were preparing for the upcoming cabin service, reviewing their procedures and ensuring all galley equipment was secure. At 8:22 p.m., Flight 800 was passing through 3,000 feet. The aircraft's rate of climb was approximately 2,000 feet per minute, standard for a 747 at this weight. The autopilot had been engaged, and the flight management computer was guiding the aircraft along its programmed departure route. This route would take them initially southeast, out over the Atlantic Ocean, before turning northeast toward their oceanic track to Paris. Below, the lights of suburban Long Island were becoming more distant. The aircraft was now over water, climbing steadily. Everything remained perfectly normal. At 8:25 p.m., New York Departure issued a new instruction.
Maintain your altitude of 15,000 feet.
This was the next step in the standard departure procedure. Kevorkian acknowledged, climb 15,000, TWA 800. The aircraft continued its smooth ascent. At this point, they were approximately 8 miles south of the Long Island coastline, over the Atlantic Ocean. The evening was clear, visibility was excellent, and there was no weather between them and Paris. Flight engineer Campbell was monitoring the fuel system, watching as the engines drew fuel from various tanks, according to the aircraft's fuel management programming. The center wing tank, with its minimal 50 gallons, was not being used for engine feed at this point. It sat there in the belly of the aircraft, its vapor-filled space heated by the air conditioning packs that had been running during the long ground delay. At 8:29 p.m., Flight 800 was approaching 13,000 feet. Preparing to level off at 15,000 feet as instructed. In the cabin, some passengers had begun to doze. Others were reading or chatting quietly with their companions. The Montoursville High School students were excited, discussing their upcoming French adventure. Honeymooning couples held hands. Business travelers reviewed documents. The flight attendants were planning to begin the beverage service soon. It was a snapshot of ordinary life at 30,000 feet, unremarkable in every way. At 8:31 p.m. and 12 seconds, the radar transponder aboard Flight 800 stopped transmitting. On the controller's radar screen at New York Air Route Traffic Control Center, the data block showing Flight 800's identification.
I see fire. Lots of fire.
Confirm aircraft?
Confirm.
Thing was there, but without any identifying information. This was not unprecedented. Transponders occasionally malfunction. Your controllers are trained to work with primary radar returns when necessary. The controller attempted to re-establish contact.
TWA 800, if you read, ident.
There was no response. He tried again.
TWA 800, if you read, ident.
Silence. The primary radar return was doing something unusual. It was fragmenting, breaking apart into multiple smaller returns, blooming across the scope like a flower opening. What happened in that instant, at 8:31 and 12 seconds, was catastrophic and instantaneous. Inside the center wing tank, the combination of fuel vapor, heat, and an electrical fault in the fuel quantity indication system wiring created a spark. The spark ignited the vapor. In a confined space filled with a flammable mixture, the ignition created an explosion. The center wing tank, located in the strongest part of the aircraft's structure, the wing box that connects the wings to the fuselage, quite literally blew apart. The explosion was not like a bomb with a single pressure wave. It was a deflagration, a rapid burning that generated enormous pressure. That pressure had to go somewhere. The tank structure failed. The explosion propagated into adjacent spaces. Within milliseconds, the structural integrity of the aircraft was compromised. The Boeing 747's forward fuselage, the section containing the cockpit and first-class cabin, separated from the rest of the aircraft. This happened so quickly that the crew had no time to react. No opportunity to transmit a distress call, no chance to don oxygen masks or prepare for impact. The separation was violent and immediate. Massive in scale, clearly visible even from miles away. The fireball grew, tumbling through the sky, breaking into pieces that rained down toward the black water below. Several witnesses were specific enough in their observations to provide investigators with crucial data. A U.S. Air National Guard helicopter crew, conducting a training exercise in the area, witnessed the explosion and immediately diverted to the crash site. Within hours of Flight 800's destruction, investigators faced a question that would dominate the next 4 years. What had caused a Boeing 747 If this was an act of terrorism, there might be ongoing threats to aviation security. If it was a mechanical failure, thousands of other 747s flying worldwide might be at risk. The investigation that followed would become one of the most exhaustive, expensive, and controversial in aviation history, ultimately costing more than $40 million and involving over 700 investigators from multiple agencies and countries. The National Transportation Safety Board, as the independent federal agency responsible for investigating civil aviation accidents in the United States, took the lead role. However, this was no ordinary NTSB investigation. Within hours of the crash, the Federal Bureau of Investigation also mobilized, treating the crash site as a potential crime scene. The FBI's involvement reflected a very real concern in the summer of 1996. On August 23, 2000, more than 4 years after Transworld Airlines Flight 800 fell from the sky, the National Transportation Safety Board convened a public hearing to present its final findings. The hearing room was packed with family members of victims, journalists, aviation industry representatives, and members of the public who had followed the investigation's long and sometimes controversial journey. NTSB Chairman Jim Hall stepped to the podium to deliver the conclusion of what had been the most expensive and exhaustive investigation in the agency's history. The probable cause statement he read that day would change aviation safety forever. The investigation had revealed a series of contributing factors, circumstances that individually might have been manageable, but together created a catastrophic situation. The board identified several critical contributing factors. First, the design and certification concept that fuel tank explosions could be prevented solely by precluding all ignition sources. This assumption, held by Boeing, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the entire aviation industry for decades, was fundamentally flawed. Investigators had proven that eliminating every possible ignition source was not feasible. Wiring degrades over time. Electrical systems can develop faults. The industry had been operating under a false sense of security. Second, the lack of a means to make the fuel tank atmospheres inert. Unlike military aircraft, which had long used fuel tank inerting systems to reduce the risk of explosion in combat, commercial aviation had not adopted this technology. The cost and complexity had been deemed unnecessary, given the assumption that ignition sources could be eliminated. Flight 800 proved this assumption tragically wrong. Third, the design and certification of the Boeing 747, with heat sources located beneath the center wing tank, without adequate means to limit the tank's exposure to these heat sources. The air conditioning packs that had heated the fuel vapor to dangerous temperatures were part of the original 747 design, certified by the FAA in the late 1960s. Nobody had fully appreciated the risk this configuration created. Fourth, and perhaps most telling, the FAA's failure to require that improvements be made to the fuel system design and certification process. The regulatory framework that governed fuel system safety had not kept pace with the realities of aging aircraft, extended ground times in hot weather, and the cumulative effects of thermal cycling over decades of operation. The changes that resulted have made modern aviation safer for millions of travelers who will never know how close their flights come to the edge of danger, protected by systems designed to prevent the catastrophe that befell Flight 800. The story of Transworld Airlines. Flight 800 is ultimately a story about how we respond to tragedy. We can point fingers, assign blame, and retreat into conspiracy theories that offer simple answers to complex questions. Or we can do the hard work of scientific investigation, accept uncomfortable truths about systemic failures, and implement changes that prevent future tragedies. The investigators, engineers, regulators, and family advocates who worked on Flight 800 chose the harder path. They asked difficult questions, they challenged industry assumptions, they demanded change. Because of their efforts, commercial aviation today is safer than it has ever been. Every flight that lands safely, every passenger who arrives at their destination, benefits from the lessons learned over the Atlantic Ocean on July 17, 1996. As we remember Flight 800, we honor not just the victims, but the principle that safety requires constant vigilance, and that complacency is the enemy of progress, and that even the most devastating tragedy can lead to positive change if we have the courage to learn from it.